Sabrina Gopaul, Butterfly, with JaneandFinch.com at the CBC building with Gillian Findlay. How are you today, Gillian?
Well, thank you.
Awesome. So how long have you been working at CBC?
Well, I've worked at CBC in two incarnations. One, when I was younger, I started at CBC as a reporter, and I worked for about 10 years. And then I left the CBC, and I went to work for ABC, the American network, and I worked overseas with them for another 10 years, give or take. And then 5 years ago, I came back.
So at what point, or what was the experience that happened in your life that you decided, I want to become a journalist?
There wasn't a single experience. In some ways, I think I fell into it for lack of other real passions that led me in other directions. You know, I thought I was at university. I was interested in certain things, and a friend was in a journalism program, and I thought that sounded kind of interesting, so I signed up, and I took the program, and that led to my first job, and it's all sort of unraveled from there. So it's not like I, at the age of 3, like some people do, decided I'm going to be a reporter. It just seemed like a really interesting thing to do, and the more I did it, the more I realized it really probably was what perhaps I was best at and what I like to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. David Milgaard's story was huge. What kind of instincts kicked in when the mother approached the press or the politicians, you know, claiming the innocence of her son? What instincts kicked in for you to say that something's up? Let me look into this.
Well, the Milgaard story is a very interesting one because that was my first story I ever did at the Fifth Estate. And prior to me coming on board, another team had actually looked into that story and had sort of concluded that there wasn't enough there. There wasn't enough. It's not that they either believed or didn't believe his story. They just felt that they couldn't prove it one way or the other. And so it sort of sat on the shelf. And so I came on board, and one of the producers I was working with initially was aware of this and was from Winnipeg and sort of knew, you know, some of the background to the story and said, you know, I think this probably deserves another look. So he was the one that was really pushing to do it. And being new to the show, you know, they needed somebody to assign to it, and I was sort of the spare body that was available. And so the two of us took it and ran with it. And, yeah, it turned out to be quite an amazing story.
Tell me what that experience was like, especially freeing a man who did 2 decades of time. That must have been so powerful.
Well, I mean, let's be clear. I didn't free David Milgaard. We didn't free him. I mean, what we did do is we raised enough questions about his conviction that the authorities, you know, and we weren't the only ones. Let's also share the credit here. But enough questions were raised by journalists that the authorities were compelled to take another look at it, and new evidence came out, and the truth ultimately came out. And I think it really is one of those cases. It's a testament to the importance of journalism, the importance of good journalism, the importance of asking the right questions, holding people accountable. And, yeah, it was one of those happy times when it all comes together and there's a really positive result.
Okay. Which story would you say you've connected to the most?
Oh, my goodness.
Or you can give a few.
I can give a few. You know, I've had the privilege of having a really varied career. I've done a lot of documentaries, and that's the kind of work I'm doing now at the Fifth Estate. But I've also worked overseas as a foreign correspondent, and that is very different, but is also incredibly rewarding. So on the one hand, I've had this amazing experience and gift, really, of being able to travel to most parts of the world and cover, you know, some of the biggest stories that are going on, and in the process getting the most amazing education I think that anybody could ever get. So, you know, there's so many of those kinds of stories that I covered when I was overseas still stick with me. But in terms of the investigative stories, that's where you really you have the ability to own a story. You know, you go out and you say, okay, this is, you know, this has happened because I did this, or the team that I'm working with did this, and if we hadn't done it, maybe that story wouldn't have been told. And that is, you know, ultimately becomes the most rewarding. So, you know, I'm very old, and you know, I've done far too many stories that nobody would remember. So I'll stick to more recent examples. I mean, most recently, the story that we've done that's had the most impact was the investigation we did into the lotteries here in Ontario. I mean, it's just was sort of wild beyond our imaginations that it would take off in the way it did, and that it would create the sort of the you know, I mean, we'd have this sort of outpouring of not only a response from the audience, but in terms of concrete things that happened, change that has come about. I mean, that was really quite a shock to us. And
you're referring to the one you received the award for? Is that one?
For oh yes, oh, you're talking about the Gemini. Yes, that's one that yeah. I mean, it was very much a team effort, and I must insist upon that. But yeah, and we've had, you know, it's won a number of awards, and but which is all very nice. But at the end of the day, I think it ultimately did bring change to a system that needed change, and that's, you know, in many ways the biggest reward.
What change are you specifically talking about?
Well, there's first of all, there was I think there's now 3 or 4 heads of lotteries in this country that are gone, have lost their jobs, because what we proved was, in fact, there was a problem with the system that people knew about and were not doing anything about it. So, you know, people who were not doing their jobs properly are no longer doing their jobs. That's a good thing. You know, there have been instances where, and I think will be more instances where people who, you know, had been in fact cheated out of their lottery winnings will have them returned to them. You know, so it's those kinds of changes that you know, you can sometimes take a great deal of, and pride's not the right word, but, you know, you take some satisfaction in knowing that all the hard work you put into something is actually paid off in a good way for some people.
One of the most difficult stories, whether it's emotionally or even physically difficult to cover a story?
Well, there's been a lot of, I mean, both. I've certainly had both. Emotionally, I suppose, is probably more interesting. A story we did a couple of years ago was an investigation into a little boy named Jeffrey Baldwin, who had died in his grandparents' care. And our story was essentially an investigation of the Children's Aid Society and how they had failed him and the family, and had knowingly left him in the care of people that they understood, and they had evidence to prove that were incapable or should have been incapable of taking care of children. That was really tough, because this was a you know, a little boy who was at that time the same age roughly as my youngest son, and he'd starved to death. And, you know, just hearing the accounts and seeing the photographs was really tough. That's one of the hardest ones I've had. I find generally, and obviously no surprise, even more so since I've had my own family, is that stories where bad things have happened to children in particular, I find the most difficult. Even when I was overseas, I remember doing stories in Africa and in the Middle East, and dealing with a lot of refugees, and you know, the terrible things that some of those people have lived through and their children have lived through, and that it always really hit home when you're you know, you're hearing what tiny children who can only trust in the parent and the adults around them to provide them with a good life and safety. When you hear some of the things that they've gone through, those are the hardest for me.
Being a woman and covering these stories, compared to men covering these stories, having this, I guess, emotional bone very much at the surface, has that been an advantage to your stories?
You know, this is a question I always have difficulty answering, because, I mean, first of all, people usually say, "Oh, you know, what's it like being a woman in a business that's still male-dominated?" In fact, this business is not male-dominated. I would say, you know, women are certainly holding their own, and in some cases probably are the majority in many newsrooms. All right, about time. But if what your real question is, do women and men bring different sensibilities to stories? I want to say no, because I think they shouldn't bring different sensibilities to stories. But I think probably there's some truth to that. I would say less and less so than when I first started out. I think there's, you know, there's more and more willingness on the part of women and men who are, reporting things to speak about the emotional toll of things and not just the physical or the economic or the financial or, the political impact of things. I mean, I think there is a sense that, an experience is wider than sometimes just the bare facts, and that we are all better reporters when we recognize that and include that in our analysis of something.
Has there been a story that you've covered that you walked into thinking, you had a good idea of where this was going and you were proven wrong?
Oh, all the time. I mean, and that's one of the lessons you learn, is that you may have expectations of what you're going to, but you can't believe that you know what the story is before you go there. I mean, otherwise, what's the point of going there, right? I'm trying to think if there's a good example, but no, I get surprised all the time, and that's one of the great things about this business. I mean, that's the terrific thing about this business, is you don't know what you're going to find out that day, what you're going to learn that day. And so it's good, and you have to be able to be surprised. I mean, if you think you know the story before you head out, you're not going to do a very good job of reporting it. So, yeah.
I'm going to take you back to the 80s. What was it like to cover the Ben Scandal Award after Seoul, Korea, and
Johnson?
Yes.
Yeah.
Especially a young man that I think Jane Finch identifies with a lot.
Yeah. It was a long time ago, and I covered the Dublin inquiry that investigated what had happened, and so I sat there day in and day out and listened to the testimony from everybody. And when I look back on it now, the thing that I'm still struck by is just really a profound sense of sadness. I think it was such a waste. Yes, it was wrong. Yes, it was a scandal. Yes, it was an embarrassment, and all the rest of it. But I think what still gets forgotten is, at the end of the day, at the heart of it was a young man who was struggling in his own way to make his way, and was surrounded by people who he trusted. And I'm not saying that he didn't have free will and that he didn't know that what he was doing was wrong. But it was much bigger than just Ben Johnson, and I think often that gets lost. It becomes he was the one that did this terrible thing, when in fact there were a lot of people around him that helped. And the pressures, absolutely, the pressures. And let's be clear. I mean, a young black man from not terrific circumstances, and this was his chance out. This was how he was going to make his name, and did make his name, and to have it all end the way it did, I think is just very sad.
Okay. You were named London correspondent. You spent some time out in Somalia. What was your experience in Somalia and also the South African election?
Well, they were both very different. We were in Somalia because there was another famine that was starting. We were there at the beginning as people were starting to understand that there was a famine coming, and this was a famine that was caused not by, in this case, by natural disaster or act of God, but it was a famine caused by war, and that was my first experience, sort of covering sort of a massive calamity in that sense, and that was eye-opening and hard. And I remember being in refugee camps and meeting these families that had walked for days and days and days to get to some place where they thought they were going to get food and help, and there wasn't a lot that could be offered them, and children died along the way, and that was a really. And I was quite young. I was a new reporter, a new foreign correspondent at that point, and it was a real eye opener for me, because it's very different to understand these things intellectually or to see them other people tell the story on television. But when you're there and you're the reporter, it's you grow up a lot. The South African election was one of those really wonderful things to have been and to have had the privilege of witnessing. I mean, it was just such a remarkable time in that country's history, in that continent's history. to see that happen and to be witness to this coming together of races and people and this common, at least at the time, what was seemed to be a common and shared sort of optimism for the future was really exciting. And absolutely. I mean, I keep looking, when I look back, I just smile, just remembering what a wonderful environment it was to work in.
Now, coming from the Western world, and these ideas and perceptions, how we look at the rest of the world, and then you have these privileges to cover these stories. Yeah. What were some of the biases or some of the ignorance you had to shed either during the process or even coming back and reflecting from these moments? Mm-hmm. What were some of the
Western biases?
Yeah.
Well, I think you're right. First of all, it's a privilege, and I don't think we can ever, those of us who do this, ever should lose track of that. What a privileged position we have. I grew up in a small town in middle-class Canada with all the advantages that brings one, and you walk into other parts of the world and you see the realities that other people who grow up in different circumstances, what they live with, what their challenges are, how they rise above those, how all of your complaints seem to diminish by comparison. I mean, you come back to this country, first of all, I think with a huge appreciation. I've never felt as proud to be a Canadian as I did when I wasn't living in Canada. I mean, I never...
Plumbing.
Absolutely, and I've just come back from 3 weeks in Afghanistan with an outhouse. So believe me, I've got a new appreciation for plumbing. But yeah, I think. I mean, that's a huge question to answer. But I think the thing I most come away with is first two things. One is people are really at heart, I think, the same the world over. They love their children. They want a better life for their children. They want to live in peace with some sense of security and this notion that they can get up the next day and work towards something. I think that is universal, and I have seen that in, everywhere I've traveled, in refugee camps, in slums, in, the salons of Europe. I mean, it's true all across the world, and I think that's something we can never lose sight of. That was the first one. And the second one is just, how difficult it is for people to even hope to attain the things that we take for granted. And I know that sounds sort of Pollyannish and all the rest of it, but it is absolutely true. I am in awe of some of the people I've met and what they've accomplished and the challenges that they faced. It's humbling.
Mm-hmm. The resilience is something I've never seen here.
No, and often I've certainly asked myself, if I were in that person's position, how would I cope? How would I get through this? And I don't have the answers. Mm-hmm. I really don't. I don't know that I could do what I've seen some people do.
You've spent some time in the Middle East. Share some of your insight with what's happening there and what people could be doing here.
Can you be a bit more specific? What's happening there in terms of?
Well, let's start with the struggles that's happening there currently.
Mm-hmm. Are you talking about Iraq in particular, or just generally speaking?
Generally speaking, in the Middle East. I mean, especially with the American elections around the corner. Like, what can this part of history can set up the world stage as?
Right. I think I was based in the Middle East for 5 years. I was in Jerusalem. I lived in Jerusalem, but I traveled throughout the region a lot. And I think as I watch now what is happening there, and this includes the war in Iraq and also what's happening with the Palestinians in Palestine, I think the thing. If your question is, what should we understand about that we don't understand sitting here, I think we underestimate the desire for autonomy. I think we in our hubris, and I would maybe be more fair and say George Bush in his hubris believes that he knows better than the people of the Middle East what kind of life they want and what kind of society they want. And I think that's always a dangerous thing when we as the Western world go in and impose values and assume that that people will accept them because we say they should. So humility goes a long, long way, both in reporting and governing, and I think we should remember to be humble, that these are very old and civilizations that have history that predates us by millennium, and we should be very hesitant to make judgments about what we think is right and wrong for people.
That's interesting to me how our reality is essentially 2% of the world's reality.
Yes.
But yet that's the reality, when technically we are living the dream. And the reality that exists is the reality that no one wants to talk about. So it's something I've always played with in my head, like, who comes up with these phrases? But
Speechwriters.
So safety is something Canada, the U.S., and the rest of the world always kind of trivializes what safety is. So coming from safety here in terms of the Western world and safety in the Middle East or parts in Africa, what do you have to say about safety?
I mean, personal safety? Are you thinking in terms of terrorism? Is that what?
There's this mood that's I think created besides the terrorism.
Yeah.
I mean, just this fear that's instilled in this world mood, this atmosphere, this climate that's being created right now. Fear is like a huge force right now for any kind of reaction to what's happening out there. So you as a journalist, but even as a woman, safety, here, Jane and Finch area as opposed to downtown Toronto, there's an idea of safety, maybe more, maybe less.
Right.
So what would your interpretation of safety be?
Well, I don't know. I have to think about this for a second. I mean, first of all, I think, if I understand where you're going with this, I think safety is something that is often, or it certainly can be, their notions of safety are things that can be exploited by others. So that if you are told that something is not safe, and you start to believe that something is not safe, then somehow inevitably things are not safe. If you know what I mean. I mean, I think that. I'm trying to. You mentioned the Jane and Finch, so I'm trying to sort of figure out how that fits into the broader context of what you're asking. But I think people need to feel less safe sometimes. It's okay to feel less safe. You don't always have to be safe. You got to take risks, right? And that includes personal risks as well as other kinds of risks. But how do you understand the world? How do you find out about other worlds, other places, if you don't take the risk to go there?
Awesome.
I don't know, does that answer your question?
No, that's totally, it's a reflective question I'd like to throw in there.
Yeah?
To see where you at.
Okay.
So you did some work with Peter Jennings.
I did.
What was that like? What was that relationship like?
I miss Peter tremendously. Peter was a huge influence on me. In large part, he was the reason I was hired at ABC. He always had this a penchant for hiring Canadians, which was good. And as you look at where American television is going, television news in particular is going, or where it's been headed since, I guess, 9/11, he was such a bulwark against that. He to me, he sort of epitomized the the high standards I think that we should all rise to or try to rise to as journalists. And I think that in many ways he was part of a generation that's passed, and there's a different kind of journalism that's being practiced now, and I think he would not be pleased to see it. And so I feel very fortunate that I had, the 8 or 9 years that I worked at ABC, that, I worked with him, and he was very hands-on as an anchor. I mean, he wasn't one of these people that just sat behind the desk and read the teleprompter. He was his and in his heart, he was a reporter, and he was always curious and always asking and always, wanting to understand, and he inspired people to be the same way, and it was really wonderful. So I miss him. I miss him a lot. I think it's a poor. The news business is poor for his absence. Yeah.
You touched on something that slipped my head. It'll come
That's
back to me. Okay. Tell me a little bit about First Do No Harm.
First Do No Harm.
I believe you guys were nominated. The Fifth Estate was nominated for
that was the story on the college on physicians and surgeons, right? Is that first? Yeah, I'm trying to, because we get these things titles that sometimes we don't give them till the end.
I didn't cut and paste properly.
Yeah. No, that's what it was. It was a story about. Nominally, it was a story about a particular gynecologist who worked in Ontario, who was found to have been responsible for dozens upon dozens of botched surgeries over a long period of time. And this was known by the hospital where he worked, and complaints had been made to the College of Physicians and Surgeons. So through documenting his story and the fact that the authorities knew about him but did nothing, we were really trying to get at the bigger issue of accountability within the medical field, in particular as it comes to the college and the idea of having a self-regulating body to govern the practices of doctors, in this case, in Canada. I mean, we leave it to doctors to police themselves, and we trust that they will do the right thing, and yet this was a case, and not the only case, but it was a case that we chose to document that showed that, indeed, they weren't doing the right thing. And a lot of women, because he was a gynecologist, a lot of women were suffering as a result, had suffered as a result. And ultimately, a class action suit was brought, and there was a settlement that was made, and a lot of these women did receive compensation for their experiences. And there were ultimately some changes made to the way the college conducts its business, and the amount of information that they will make available now to people who want to find out what a doctor's or a surgeon's record is. But at the time, it was very controversial, and the college was very opposed to making that information available. So I think, and it wasn't the only thing that resulted in change. It was a small part of the puzzle, but eventually some change did come. More change probably should come and perhaps will come. But, I thought it was an important story for us to have done.
Of course. You touched on it a little bit about how journalism is taking different directions.
Yeah.
For instance, I just turned on BBC, and Britney Spears was headline news. That broke my heart to see BBC,
BBC no
covering
less.
that.
Oh,
so I think I understand where you're going with that, but can you share with myself even how journalism is now taking these different shapes, and even for me, it's questioning the ethics of storytelling and what should be headline stories or news compared to what is being getting that time. What's your take on that?
Well, I can tell you my observations. I can't explain to you why, because I don't make those decisions. But there's no question that Britney is big news, and all kinds of things that should be covered in this country are not big news. And that's wrong. In my opinion, that's wrong. Why does it happen? There is this belief that, I guess in some cases it's more than a belief, but that we work in a competitive environment, and that ultimately we have to be responsible to some business plan somewhere that says that we have to have more people watching than the next network. And there is a further belief that the way you get more people to watch is you titillate them with news of Britney or Lindsay or whomever, and they're once you accept those premises, then that's not surprising we have what we have. I would question both of those things. I don't know that I don't necessarily believe that people want to watch that. I don't know that we are giving them what they want, if that's the argument for doing this. And I certainly don't believe that that we are, that is our role, our role is to tell people what's going on, tell them what's important, educate them, and, entertainment's a different business. That's not the news business. Totally. And also, I think, the idea that the devolution of Britney Spears, it should be anybody's entertainment is just obscene. Yeah. This is still a young woman's life, and who's unraveling in a very public way, and I think it frightens me, actually. I don't know that it's a huge step from that to, public executions, where do we draw the line then?
Yeah, journalism is now this ethic.
Well, it's always been about ethics, but I think the questions are a lot harder now, and I think the commercial pressures, even at a public network like the CBC, the commercial pressures are very strong, and that's why we as journalists and the managers of journalists have to be very strong back, and those are daily battles that are fought, and sometimes the good guys win and sometimes they don't.
We'll see BBC News tonight.
We'll see what BBC. It's a bit frightening when even the BBC goes down that road. That
was really something that I was taken aback, but it's journalism.
Your experience being a woman in journalism and putting in the time that you have, what are some key milestones or moments for women in journalism that you've seen?
Oh boy, key moments. I have problems with the whole gender thing because I don't, I grew up at a time, as old as I am, I still grew up in a time when, as a young woman or as a girl, you could believe that you would have exactly the same opportunities to succeed or fail as the boy sitting next to you in class, and I think that's absolutely true. And I'm the mother of a daughter, and I think that's true of her generation, even more true of her generation. Go back to my mother's generation, that was a different thing. So I don't feel like my generation of women have really opened that many doors. I think it's the generation that came before us that opened the doors, and we've walked through them. And so I would go back in terms of women. I'd go back to some of the women who were war correspondents early on, and even in a Canadian context. My heroine when I was a young woman was watching Ann Medina. She was the first woman correspondent, foreign correspondent I'd ever seen, and here she was running around the world and asking tough questions, and so I think those are the people who actually deserve the credit for breaking down whatever barriers. By the time I was of the age and had gone to journalism school, frankly, the networks, this is more of a television thing, had to sort of clued into the fact that, maybe it was kind of a novelty to have women reporting some of these things, and perhaps there was an audience that wanted to see women reporting some of these things, and so therefore there were a lot of opportunities. And now I think it's probably, I would say even in my generation, perhaps it was easier for a woman to in some cases make progress. If you compared her against her male colleagues, simply because there was the novelty factor. I think my sense now is, for the next generation coming up, it's really is an even playing field. It really now does depend on your abilities and and your talents, and I just don't think it's much of an issue anymore. I'm sure there's women out there who would disagree with me, but in my observation is that it's different now.
Do you think that's true with more ethnic backgrounds,
That's
do
a
you
different
think?
question.
Yeah.
That's a different question, and I'm not, really qualified to answer, because I'm as white bread as they come. You probably would be better informed about that than I do. I know that there's efforts. I certainly know there's efforts in this building to identify and to train and to put in places of influence people from different ethnic backgrounds and minorities. Whether they're doing it successfully, whether they're choosing the right people, whether it's enough, I don't know. I mean, that's something an audience really has to. I know that there's goodwill, and I know that change is always sometimes controversial within, and I have no doubt it has been controversial at some levels within this building. Decisions that were made, but it's happening. It's probably not happening fast enough. But more and more young women, young people generally from different backgrounds who become trained, who become better at what they do. I mean, there'll be no reason not to. I mean, I think that I think the will's there. I don't think anybody is standing back and saying this is not what we should be doing. I don't know. What do you think?
I've been creating my own opportunities, but we'll see. We'll see.
And that's how it gets done.
And
right?
yeah, I do believe that. I mean, especially Toronto, it is what it is. So I mean, they are a couple steps ahead. So I totally have faith that this is something that will be moving upward and onward. Maybe slow or too slow for me, but everything was just slow for me.
Yeah, well, and at the end of the day, these kinds of things are reflective of the society. So I think you're right. In Toronto, it's a very multi-ethnic community, and so increasingly you're seeing, it's a multi-ethnic face that you see looking out at you from your television set. Other parts of the country that may not be as true.
Yeah. Have you seen or met up with the glass ceiling? Has that been? I know you want to pull away from gender, but how's that glass ceiling doing? Does it exist?
Oh, I think it still does exist. I don't think I have any real personal experience. I mean, I have been tremendously lucky and blessed, and I've had so many opportunities. And if I've failed to achieve others, frankly, I have nobody else to blame but myself. I mean, I honestly can't think of a single situation I've been in where I've come to the conclusion that it's because I'm a woman that I didn't get X, I mean, it's, I honestly can't say that. Does it still exist? I'm sure it does, and I'm sure, I think in management, probably, my instinct is that it's more real, more present. The great thing about being a reporter is, like if you want something, if you want to tell a story, you just go out and tell it, and there could be a million glass ceilings or a million people up above you who are saying you can't do that. But when you prove to them you can, that all disappears, right? At the end of the day, you're as good as your product. And if you turn in good product, what can anybody say, So, how else, I mean, I don't know how else you'd go about doing it, but, and I can only speak to it from this background and from this business. I mean, if we're talking law or medicine or account management, I mean, probably it's a very different reality. But to be honest, I don't think it exists in the reporting world anymore. I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that. What is difficult, and I don't want to diminish this at all, is the realities of women juggling careers and family. It has not gone away. And so I think often, it's not so much that there's a glass ceiling, but there are, there's
24 hours in a day.
Yeah, there's 24 hours in a day, and this business is not conducive to 9 to 5 and being able to be home to pick up the kids, and all the rest of it. So I've been able to do it in large part because I have a spouse who's incredibly flexible and has picked up a lot of the slack, and not everybody is as lucky as that, is the truth of the matter. So that, that's a real reality for women, and probably it does hold a lot of women back.
So, who inspires you? Doesn't have to be within our field, but
Who inspires me? Barack Obama inspires me these days. I think he does everybody. Who inspires me? My kids inspire me. I mean, you know what, I'll tell you what, I'll give you an example. I just came back from Afghanistan, and I spent 3 weeks at the NATO-run military hospital there. We were doing a story about that hospital and what it's like to work there, and it's mostly Canadians who work there, both military and civilian medical people. And they inspired me. Here are these people, doctors and nurses and medics and all the rest of it, working in the middle of a war zone and seeing really awful stuff. I mean, they see the worst. They see the young men who come in with their legs blown off. They see the kids who come in because they've been caught in crossfire. They see, the worst that war can offer. And they get up every day and they fix what they can. They do what they can to make it better. And, they don't get a lot of recognition, and they don't, a lot of them, don't necessarily even believe in what the mission is that Canada's, that we ostensibly went to Afghanistan for. I mean, they probably, a lot of them, I don't even know if they could articulate what the reasons that Canada went to Afghanistan. But they know that there's people there that are getting injured every day that need help, and so they do that. They provide that help. And that inspires me, I think people doing good things simply because they know it's the right thing to do is inspirational.
Yeah, that's really good.
Okay, so you spent some time in Jane and Finch.
I did.
I'm sure you
And
walked
lived to tell
in.
the tale.
I'm sure you walked in with some ideas and perceptions of the Jane and Finch community.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that, that ignorance that you might have left on the
Yeah.
other side of the planet? What types of ignorance did you leave in Jane and Finch and walk away with? If any.
Yeah, no. I want to give you an honest answer here. So let me think about this for a second. I don't think I know what the stereotypes are, and certainly when I told people, certainly people who have grown up in Toronto, that we were doing this documentary in Jane and Finch, and we were spending a lot of time up there and meeting people and blah blah blah. Some of them sort of were horrified, and without putting too fine a point on it, there were people in this building who were concerned about our safety if we were going to spend so much time at Jane and Finch. I think I've sort of been around enough, certainly around other parts of the world enough to understand that, it's very rarely, the stereotypes very rarely stand up. So I sort of, I didn't go in there sort of accepting those, and I knew that it would not be the same. So but nevertheless I come to it from a different perspective. So what did I learn about it, and how did my thinking change? I think I came away with a greater empathy, compassion maybe, for the difficulty of people, and because we were focusing on young men and young men who were trying to sort of find their way out of some of the problems they found themselves in, a greater empathy for how difficult that is, that, there's not a lot of support, there's not a lot of help, despite, and I'm not diminishing all the good work that gets done there and all the well-meaning people who go there and try to provide programs and funding and all the rest of it. At the end of the day, there's not enough. And it's, to do something like that on your own, to make changes in your life. I don't want to say to escape Jane and Finch, because I don't think it's a place that needs to be escaped from. But there are people there, young people, a lot of young people there, who need a hand, need a hand to make something of their lives, who have the potential, who perhaps are misdirected in some ways or get caught up in things that they then can't control, which I think is easy to do, and not just in Jane and Finch, but it happens there. I have compassion for the difficulty in making changes in your life, and I guess, I just did that. I don't know if it surprised me But I think once you sort of put a face to the problem or the face, then you sort of start living it through one person's life, and you see how that one person deals with it day to day, and that, that gives you a different perspective. It's not just a society's problem anymore, it's this person's problem, and how do we help?
Put that in my earpiece.
Yeah, where's your earpiece? Okay, ready to go.
All right. Share some of your experience with us when working on the Lost Struggle documentary.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you just want to leave it as open-ended as that?
A little specific.
Well, I mean, if you have a more specific question, ask it, because, if there's some particular point you want to go to, by all means ask it. I mean.
So a lot of the community members and organizations, after seeing the documentary, there was this divide within the community. Part of the community felt or feels that this underbelly society does exist, and this is a reality for our young people. But on the other side of things, some community or some parts of the community might have felt that it was exploitive, that CBC came in and sensationalized an issue without looking at it holistically. What would you say?
Okay. I think the first thing I would say is our intent in doing the documentary wasn't to come in and paint a portrait of Jane Finch. I mean, that was not what our mandate was. And if we were to come in and if somebody said, we want you to do the definitive documentary of the neighborhood of Jane and Finch and what is that neighborhood like, we would have done a very different documentary, no question. That wasn't our intention. We had very specific questions that we wanted to answer. And the primary among them was, why is it that, I'm choosing my words carefully here, why is it that young men in particular from neighborhoods like Jane and Finch, we could have easily have gone to other cities that have their own disadvantaged neighborhoods, how is it they find themselves in trouble? And why is it so difficult? And this was the real question. Why is it so difficult for them to get out once they're in? That was our purpose in doing it. If you go back and look at the documentary, we see that right up front. And so therefore, that's why we chose the people we chose. That's why we followed them in the way that we did. We weren't there to paint the entire picture of Jane and Finch. We were there to say, here's a couple of kids, young men, that by their own admission are living lives that they don't like, that they've gotten themselves into situations they don't like, and that want to try to change that in some way. And that to us was very interesting. So how, if you're a kid in a situation like that, do you go about living in that kind of environment, go about trying to make that change? And that then it was just a matter of seeing what happened. So my apologies to those who feel that we exploited. I don't think we exploited at all. I think we were trying to, and you can argue whether we succeeded or not, but certainly our intention was to try to show the realities. Not everybody's reality, I accept that, but it was their reality. And I like to think, I have to think, that we educated some people. I know we educated some people.
Is there a ripple effect or some kind of aftermath that's happening from the documentary up until now, or has it settled in CBC's house?
It was never, I don't think it was ever controversial within the CBC. When it first ran, it was very interesting to talk to, people in my neighborhood, for instance, and I got a whole range of reaction from, that was amazing. I was I'd never really understood, and thank you, because I think I now understand better. That can't be true. It must have all been faked. I mean, that doesn't really happen there, right? Sometimes people sort of want to believe what they want to believe, and even if you sort of say, okay, well, this is the reality that we managed to capture over that 9 months of filming. Some people don't want to believe it; they're not going to believe it. But we haven't had. I know that there have been people within the community who would have liked to have seen a different aspect of Jane and Finch examined, but beyond that, I don't think we've had a lot of certainly I've not heard a lot of complaints. Maybe you know of some, but I don't.
No.
No? Okay.
Is there any advice you can share with especially young women that are thinking of getting into this industry? Any kind of advice or, wisdom, pieces of wisdom you can share with our viewers?
Well, I hesitate. I don't feel very wise, so I don't know that I'm the best person to come to for wisdom. And whatever advice I do have to give, I would give to young men or women alike. I mean, it's not, it's not a gender thing. I think you have to be disciplined, and you have to be curious, and you have to, sort of make a pact with yourself if you want to really pursue this line of work, that you want to understand, and you wherever you go, whatever story you decide to pursue, that ultimately it's the understanding that's important, and that you do hold a privileged position, and that you do get to go places and explore places that people will never get to go to and explore, and they rely on you to report back accurately and fairly and humbly about what you find. And I think that's important. It's never about you. It's always about the story. And I think that's the one thing that we should all remember. It's always about the story.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.